Hey, Robert.
Hey, Yaron, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. How about you?
Pretty good, although the market's crashing again today, so it's always
But we
exciting.
kind of predicted that. We've talked about this in previous, we're not going to talk about the market today, but we have talked about this in previous shows. This is not unexpected.
It's not a shock, no.
No. All right. But today we're not going to talk about markets. We're actually going to talk about the application of Ingenuism to an area we haven't talked about explicitly before, at least on the riffs, which is the funding of science. I think it's kind of obvious that science research is crucial to human progress, to economic growth, to increased productivity, and that Ingenuism applies to how we do science. So maybe talk a little bit about how you think Ingenuism applies to it, and then we can talk about what the model is today and how we would like to see it changed, maybe.
Well, it's like the opposite of our topic last week. Instead of talking about markets, we're talking about somewhere that needs a market.
Yeah.
Because the way that we have evolved to fund science is in a very centralized, credentialed, risk-averse manner. And by that, I mean, it's very difficult for people to amass for scientific research. This isn't true for the commercialization of science or for trying new business models on science. There you can go to Silicon Valley or go to the Vision Fund and maybe get billions of dollars to try something that makes no sense to anyone except for you. And then it either works out or it doesn't in your WeWork. But in basic science, it's moved from, and you probably know a lot more about history than I do, but it's moved from more of a sponsored approach where there was a market in a very informal sense, much like art. And it's evolved into something that is very much centralized, either in large corporate laboratories or more often than not in universities that are mainly government funded or government funding directly through grants itself. Yeah. And that is a very different kind of market, because that's basically how it was in a lot of industries pre-2000, where you had a small number of centralized gatekeepers. You had the editors of the big publishing houses, or you had the heads of the big movie studios, and they made all the decisions. Except that they were economically motivated. They were rewarded or punished based on the decisions they made. Now we have very centralized decision-making. You've got committees that determine the direction of entire lines of research, or whether a line of research even gets started. And they bear no costs if they make bad decisions. I guess there's some reputational cost, but it usually is after years or even decades. And they have no direct upside. And when they do have upside, it's not to the specific project that's being funded, because it's not nepotist enough where you approve your own grants. But where they are looking at the grants is from a commercial standpoint as alternatives to wherever they're focused as competitors. So it's a really distorted, very non-market, very non-ingenuous approach to something that is really core to Ingenuism, which is scientific research, exploration, and discovery.
Yes, I looked into the history a little bit, and it's hard to separate things out. What is basic science research versus application, a next step of more application versus development, what's called development and R&D. But basically 90% of all R&D was funded by the private sector, and including basic research before World War II, including universities. Universities raised money for basic research. They found donors. There was a lot of cooperation, particularly at MIT and at Stanford, between businesses and scientists at the university. A lot of it was therefore secret. So because the company wanted to maintain the intellectual property, so there were not a lot of publications. There wasn't a lot of the sharing of information that we have today. And then World War II happened, and that really shifted everything. And primarily Department of Defense, which I think spends about 60% of all the government dollars on science. The rest is the National Science Foundation, and the big one is the National Institute for Health. But even today, of what's defined as basic research, basic science, the government's, it's about 50-50 between government and the private sector, with pharmaceuticals being the dominant player in the private sector. So as you'd expect, big pharma, but also biotech companies, I think that all counts. So, because biotech, as we know, they do a lot of basic research before they have a product. So venture capital investing in biotech is often, don't expect to see anything for 10 years because they're doing basic research. So it's about 50-50. And it was higher. So the government spending on basic research peaked in the 60s and 70s and has kind of been declining. Not as a total dollar amount, but as a percentage of all the research being done since then. But yes, it's a government model. And one of the things that centralized model, and even in the private sector, I think there's a lot of government grants that come in. And part of the challenge there is that I read somewhere that, scientists spend a significant amount of their time now, about 25% of their time as scientists, writing grant proposals. And there's a format. So they teach now, it's STEM programs. They teach you how to write a grant proposal. It's a class and you get a practice. And so much of the energy is devoted to how do you write the grant proposal? How do you appeal to the right authorities? How do you appeal to the right people? And then it turns out in every field, there's a relatively small group of people that make all the decisions. So it's exactly the opposite of how the Silicon Valley model works and how we'd expect Ingenuism to work.
You end up with some of the same complaints in Silicon Valley, where entrepreneurs that are passionate about what they're trying to build and very talented, very skilled, end up spending a significant amount of time raising money and working with investors. But it's a different model in the sense that you get a small amount of money and then you prove yourself over time in order to get a large amount of money. The Vision Fund doesn't actually give you billions of dollars when you just have some scribblings on a cocktail napkin. That happens after you've really developed your idea. Now, it still may be crazy, but it's now something that you've proven some ability to advance. And scientific grants don't work that way. Scientific grants, in a sense they do, in that a lot of times the grants are given to people based on their past research.
Yep.
So they're basically funding the last project, but it's not a small amount to experiment. And then increasing automatically, in a sense, increasing amounts if things are going well. It's much less efficacious than that. And so having something like, and you probably know more about fast grants than I do, but having something like a fast grants model where there's some money that just gets thrown around to interesting ideas to then see which of them get momentum, and then having some that pipeline being fed into a much larger pool, which is sort of informally what fast grants is trying to do. That's a much more interesting model, because if you look at centralized, or I'll say government, but it isn't. You made the exact point that it's not really government, it's centralized investment into science. Is what we've evolved into is two very different pools, which sort of complement each other. You get a large amount of money being invested through these government agencies that is very risk averse. It's very much based on credentialing and impressing a small group of gatekeepers. And then you also have a large amount of money being invested by the Department of Defense, where the Department of Defense doesn't care about the cost. Isn't really an issue. Yeah. Will this produce something that could be game changing, which is kind of the Silicon Valley model. But there's no link between them. There isn't a natural way where the Department of Defense is funding something that then would evolve into automatically being funded for the private sector through the government. Now, sometimes that does happen outside through a private venture, but it's much harder to take a innovation that's been developed for the Department of Defense and migrated over than it would be if you were in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and there's an interesting effect to this giving grants to people who've already been successful, and that is there's an age effect. People have documented this, that government grants are typically given to older scientists, particularly basic research science. And what's interesting is that probably also happened in Silicon Valley. There was a period in which Silicon Valley was funding serial entrepreneurs who were getting older, and there was a market opportunity. And this is how Y Combinator came about. They recognized that there was actually a segment that was underserved by the traditional Silicon Valley VCs, and that this segment not only had great ideas, but also with a little bit of coaching, which I think is the kind of their idea, is that they provide more coaching than a traditional VC. There was massive opportunity. So the market kind of fixed itself. An opportunity was created, and then that mechanism doesn't exist in kind of a centralized marketplace, partially because the rewards are not direct, right? You're not investing in reaping a benefit. So the feedback mechanisms don't work, and therefore it breaks down. So science, you get older doctors or older researchers, and history suggests that, particularly in science, great real breakthrough ideas are like rock and roll. They are something young people do. Yes. Einstein was super young when he wrote those, when he wrote both his breakthrough papers on, and actually as he got older, he did less. That is, we don't know much about any kind of, he tried to do unified theory when he was older, and it was not successful. But his two breakthrough, he was like a patent clerk, and he was writing papers in the evening on the side.
Yeah, and when he was older and recognized, he's what you read. I mean, neither of us were around at the time, but what it appears is that he became one of the graybeard naysayers. Yep. Quantum theory, that can't possibly work. He has a quote of saying, "Nuclear power is a pipe dream."
Well, he was partially a pacifist politically, so he objected to it. So it could have motivated that, but yeah. And he didn't.
That was specifically about nuclear power versus about the bomb.
Yeah.
And of course, it's much harder. It's much harder to build something where you can harness the power versus just letting it go wild.
Yeah. So this is. I was reading an article about Alzheimer's. It was published recently in June. Well, no, not recently, June 2019. But it's about Alzheimer's and how. About 20 years ago, the top researchers in the field solidified around a particular theory of what caused Alzheimer's as amyloid deposits in the brain. And it was as good a theory as any other theory at the time, maybe even better than other theories. But what happened was all the senior people were amyloid people, and they invested heavily, research dollars, approval, even scientific papers were not, they approved all the papers that promoted the amyloid hypothesis. And that people who offered alternative hypothesis couldn't get funding, couldn't get speaking gigs at conferences, couldn't get into the journals, the top journals. And now, 20 years later, it turns out it's not amyloid. And a lot of the ideas that were proposed 20 years ago are being proposed now, and people are now starting the research, and we're 20 years behind in that ingenuous trial and error type, hypothesize, try it out, see what you can learn from it mechanism. And I mean, it's tragic, because one of the most horrific things that can happen to you as you age is getting Alzheimer's. So you see this in action, and who knows over how many other diseases this has been the case. And nobody did this out of spite. Nobody did this because they hated other people. They truly believed all the money should go in this, but the system didn't allow for alternatives.
Yeah, that's a great example, because one of the core tenets of Ingenuism is some form of intellectual honesty or even humility, where even if something is the best answer that you can possibly come up with today, it doesn't mean it's the right answer. And in fact, against all answers to a complex question, if you compare that one best answer to all the other possibilities, known and unknown, it's very unlikely to be the right answer. And so that kind of humility is hard for established people who have made their reputations on a particular research track. That's hard for them to maintain throughout their career. Versus young people, I think that some of it is the creativity that exists when we're younger than versus when we're older. But I think a lot of it is young people aren't carrying that kind of baggage around. They don't have all of these opinions and ideas and commitments that they've made to their research agenda. They're really a blank slate. And it is tragic, both in Alzheimer's. It's tragic that this is probably one of 100 or 1,000 examples of where we've shut down the exploration process for years or even decades and lost the benefits of ingenuity. Because if you shut down this experimenting and discovering and then trying and testing and taking the feedback to evolve and refine your theories, then you really have killed progress. I mean, we assert that's 90% of progress. And of course, 90% is just a made up round number, but it's the vast majority of progress. And you can so easily kill it. You can kill it in a small area like that, or you can kill it on a broader area by focusing on, we need more basic science funding. And I think both of us would agree that there is massive value just lying around because the right research is not getting done. But if you solve that problem in the wrong way, you end up spending a lot of money and not getting any results, and actually tainting the idea that we could be progressing faster. We could be growing at 4 or 5% real on average every year. We could do that for another century. We could end up on other planets. All of the things that look impossible when you just don't get much of a return for the money you spend. And that's where we are. I mean, I saw a statistic, and of course, who the hell knows if it's right, but it rings true that over the last 12 years, roughly half of all scientific papers have been published. And part of that is the internet and the cost of publishing has gone way down, and that's a very good thing. But when we measure productivity in research, it's basically either publications or patents. And if those are continuously being devalued, if you're just getting more, but not more impactful research or impactful discoveries, then you're benchmarking off of something that has no tie to reality. And of course, that's been our experience. There's been a lot of talk over the last 2 decades about the stagnation, about how after the initial internet boom, we haven't seen the increase in productivity that we would have expected. We haven't seen the progress that we would have expected. And if you are focused on the wrong thing, because in a sense, we have a market in science, and it's publications and patents.
Exactly.
And if those don't actually provide you with good feedback, then you're just continuously being pushed in the wrong direction.
So what are some of the solutions? I mean, a number of solutions, fast grants have been proposed where the government still handles 50% of all the grants, but it does it in a completely different way, breaks up the bureaucracy and allows for fewer proposals, but much more flexibility and innovation in the grant making. How realistic is that for the government to do that? And if that's not the solution, do you have any proposals? Is there any way to, how do we get out of this?
Well, the ingenuous approach would be to start experimenting with different types of alternative grant granting mechanisms. So if you come up with a solution, if we were to say, oh, look, Yaron, if we just did this, it would all work out, that would be total BS. It would be anti-ingenuous. And it also almost certainly wouldn't work. That would be in the same vein, exactly what we were just talking about. One solution presented as the answer, while there are thousands, millions of alternatives that we haven't thought of that could be much better, or some combination. You have to discover it. You can't think it through. And you're always good at reminding me of that, because it's really tempting to try and come up with, oh, what's my answer? And as long as you remember that's just my answer, it's not the answer, it's okay. But our brains don't generally work that way. So what I would like to see is a lot of experiments. Fast grants is a great experiment. The X Prizes is a great experiment. I'd like to see an acknowledgement of where the money is currently being spent, the way it's currently being spent, that it's failed us, that it hasn't produced the kind of results that are available, and that the risk-averse approach, where you have lots of committees and lots of steps where you're trying to make sure that only the best get approved, but then you're just making it up. Basically, you could have drawn it out of a hat almost as well. Is that approach? It's appealing, especially to people who are insiders, who are controlling that process, but it's not effective. And there's so much value to be gained that we can afford to make some mistakes. I mean, Silicon Valley doesn't try and minimize losses, it tries to maximize upside.
Yep.
And the grant process tries to minimize losses. So I'd like to see something. Now, we could experiment with basically a universal basic income for scientists of, with certain degrees or doing certain kind of work. You could experiment with, I've seen proposals to just divide all that money up equally across all the PhDs in the field that are at top 20 universities. That creates all of its own disincentives and problems. But it's at least an attempt to say, look, what we have isn't working, and so let's figure out what does work. And then, of course, you have to be willing to look at the results, and how do you measure the results is a challenge, because if you just look at papers and patents, I promise you there'll be lots of papers and patents. It would be awesome if we could have, we have these NFT markets for literally an infinite number of potential NFTs that get created, and somehow you end up with markets for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I wish we had the same thing for patents. So we had some market feedback on, if every patent were put up and people could bid on them. Yeah. And then we would at least get some idea of how much of this is nonsense and how much of it is really worth something.
Partially do you think commercialization of these ideas is a measure? So, I mean, universities have gotten much better over the years in commercializing some of the discoveries. That seems to, and I think that there was a bill that was passed, I forget the name of it, 20 years ago or so, that encouraged university, encouraged university to commercialize, to move the science into commercializing phase. But even there, because even there, they approached it in a one-size-fits-all in terms of how much, because the university is getting public money, how much can it profit from it? It had a, so you break up that experimentation again, even with that.
Yeah, yes, that's definitely gone on, and universities have become more tilted towards what we would call applied, although I don't think anyone actually has a good definition of the difference between applied and basic research, because it's all on a continuum.
Although some basic research is not going to be applied anytime soon, right? So I don't know. String theory is not applicable to anything.
Until it is, but yes, I agree with you. And then, of course, if you get outside of the hard sciences, there's all sorts of research, a lot of which is funded by these same grant makers, that has, as far as I can tell, no application to the world anyway.
Maybe detrimental. Yeah.
Possibly. But that's part of what governments do. I mean, there's a continuous theme among governments of wanting to both restrict, tax, regulate, discourage something, and then also at the same time subsidizing it. And if you think about how that's going to go, it's generally terrible, because any sort of tax, regulation, attempt to control is going to be borne by the most successful, the most innovative players in the market. So if you don't want companies to get too big, you're going to focus on the companies that are really successful, the companies that have done a really good job of providing value to their customers and recruiting employees and taking care of them, all the things that it takes to build a leading company. If you're going to regulate them, or if you want to increase taxes on them or tax them at all, you're basically discouraging the exact thing that we say that we want, which is people to go out and do things that benefit the world. And it's hard to estimate, but there are many estimates of the fraction of the value that's captured by companies in terms of the products that they produce, vis-a-vis the surplus that customers get and all the other constituents, scientists, how much they get. And it's always a single-digit percentage.
Yep.
And it's probably in the mid uppers for companies, and it's definitely in the low single digits for scientists.
Yep.
So yeah, this situation is a little worse for scientists, absolutely, 100%. But we're also doing the exact same thing with Google.
Yep.
We're talking about restricting their activities or taxing them. We're putting them in a position where they'll do less of that value creation, and at the same time trying to ask for more. The world would be a better place if more of this happened. And when you are subsidizing and restricting at the same time, you end up putting the costs on the most successful folks, and then the subsidies tend to be spread much more broadly. And often they are focused on the laggards. I mean, we see that all the time. I'm not sure you see it in scientific research. I wouldn't say that at all. But I will definitely say that the grant proposal and approval process is a lot less clear-eyed and cold-hearted as Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley.
I think that's absolutely right. So, so unsurprisingly, my solution to this would be to get the government out of it and to find a way for the government, if it could, and I don't know how exactly you would do this. You'd have to think about it, to incentivize people to invest in basic research. Because one of the problems is that the idea is the private sector would underinvest in basic research. It's a public good, and therefore the government has to do it. Well, if the government's getting involved, maybe instead of doing it directly, maybe they can incentivize even bigger tax, but of course that creates its own problems. But then what you get is you immediately get the experimentation, right? Because you get, I don't know, Jeff Bezos interested in physics and somebody else interested in biology and somebody else, and they're going to invest in different types of basic research. They're going to have come up with different mechanisms to invest in basic research. You're going to have the kind of thing that Y Combinator did with Silicon Valley. Oh, here's an opportunity that nobody's investing in. I can go and invest in that. And you'd get both billionaires, companies, foundations, maybe even new institutions that would aggregate. Like I would consider putting some money in as a kind of quote charitable contribution into something that invested in a particular thing I was excited about in science, right? And I think a lot of people would, and it would increase the population's interest in science because now they could invest in it. So I think somehow finding a way to privatize the process, and thus not privatizing it by centralizing it in one place, but privatizing it by letting markets do what they do best, which is kind of providing these multiple options and experimentation.
And the word I like to use instead of privatizing, although I'm a fan of privatization, is personalizing. Mm-hmm. Is instead of having a centralized approach, having some experiments on more distributed. And that's part of why we're very excited about crypto, despite the crypto crash and our enormous skepticism about most of what's gone on in crypto so far, is because you need a mechanism to organize. When you personalize things, you need a mechanism to organize people, or you give up all of the benefits of collaboration. Mm-hmm. And collaboration is a huge benefit. But you need to make it possible. There needs to be a mechanism for it, and that's actually Silicon Valley's main value add. Is it's a way for passionate entrepreneurs to organize and collaborate, and then to partner and collaborate with investors to build world-changing companies. But it's just one approach, and it's an approach that was developed in the 1960s and hasn't evolved that much. It's definitely evolved, don't get me wrong, but it hasn't evolved that much. And considering how different the world is than it was 60 years ago, it seems like there should be a way that the Silicon Valley approach could be applied to a lot of different problems, including Silicon Valley, in new and exciting ways. And that's what I would like to see in basic research. There's lots of ideas that I have about not taxing it and subsidizing it less, or maybe subsidizing it differently.
Yep.
It would, if we look at the vaccines for COVID, there was basic research that was done, and there was some government funding, and there was some non-government funding, and it existed. So the mRNA technologies were not starting from square one, in which case they would have been useless and probably assumed to be ineffective and impossible. And instead, there was some proof of concept enough that there was a massive amount of resources mobilized behind using them to create vaccines that ended up being worth trillions of dollars to the planet. But there was also the other piece, which is that governments, particularly the US government, but a lot of governments followed in their footsteps of making advanced purchase agreements.
Yep.
And that's sort of like the prizes, right? And maybe it's a better way to do it, because instead of giving a prize for creating a prototype, you give a prize for introducing mass production and actually fulfilling demand.
Yeah.
But if the government's going to be if we're going to have centralized decision making, I would like to see it on something that is at the tail end, where we say, if you get there, we'll buy your product. You figure out how to do that. Everything else is your responsibility. But there's billions of dollars waiting for you. Versus we're going to give you money up front, and then as you are successful, we're just going to make your life harder and harder and harder as you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, because it's so centralized today, change is going to be slow and change is going to be difficult. But that's now's the time to propose big changes, because there's a lot of discussion about this, which is good. So I'm positive in the sense that a lot of people are talking about it. I'm seeing more and more articles about it. It's a problem that people are trying to address. The solutions will probably still be a challenge, but at least they'll move the ball a little bit forward.
I'm gonna challenge it'll take a long time, although it seems like it would. And I'm gonna agree with it felt like it used to be that it was just grumpy academics who said this is crazy. And now you're getting people outside of academia pointing at it and saying this is crazy, and what could we do differently? But it does seem like it's a huge challenge, that there's this entrenched constituency that would never give up the power that they have. And that's always true until something goes around them. And that's crypto might be it, or it might be something else, but there needs to be a channel to provide the alternative. That's where the publishing houses suddenly lose all of their control over what we read, or the movie studios lose control over what kind of video we're able to watch. You need that incremental channel, and until it's there, it seems impossible. But once it shows up, it's suddenly like, wow, this is amazing. Now we can have millions of videos, or now anyone can publish a book. And I wouldn't rule out that we could see that in our careers, certainly in our lifetimes.
All right, that is a great optimistic end note for today. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Yaron.
All right, see you next week.